Good evening. It's good to see everyone this evening. We got probably interesting. Buck was talking about faith, and we're in Hebrews 11, household of faith. So faith is the evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen, Hebrews 11:1. Kind of an interesting, a lot of different variations of that in the Greek, if you're into Greek, wonder what that means. But it's kind of, faith is different. You know, what is faith? According to the Hebrew writer, faith is having confidence in something that you're never going to see. I mean, that's really what faith is. Faith is the assurance of things you hope for. That's really what the Hebrew writer says. Isn't that what faith is? You know, faith has to do with credibility, right? If you know somebody and you have a relationship with them and they tell you something, you believe it, right? Even if you've never seen it, you believe it because you know that person is credible. You have faith in what they say. You have faith in the credibility of that individual. That's something that the Bible works on with us all the time. Buck says, have an answer for why you have faith. Well, I have faith because of what God has done for me, what God does for me. So I believe he will do what he says he's going to do because he's credible, right? Someone that isn't credible, you don't have faith in what they say. You're like, well, maybe it is, maybe it's not. I knew a guy one time, and he's dead now. Mark Hyde ain't here tonight, or he'd laugh with me. But I knew a guy one time, and he would tell you stuff that you literally could just not believe the stuff he would tell you. I mean, he would tell you the craziest stuff you ever heard in your life. But I come to learn over the years that it was always true. You know, even though he would tell you the craziest stuff you'd ever heard, it was true. And it was one of them guys that and it was just kind of an interesting deal because he would tell you something and anybody else would tell you what he said, you'd be like, oh, you're crazy, there ain't no way. But after a while, I learned that when he told it, no matter how crazy it was real because he was credible. You know, and I'd learned that. Why did I learn that? Because that was my experience with him. I didn't believe him right away either. I thought, oh, you're crazy, there ain't no way, you're just telling me a story. As I found out he wasn't, then he became more and more credible to me. So faith has a lot to do with credibility. It has a lot to do with believing something will happen based on your experience with what has happened. Faith isn't blind, should never be blind. God never asks us to have blind faith. He never says just have faith because I say it, right? He says have faith because look at the things I'm doing that are real. If this is real, why wouldn't that be real? You know, Jesus did some incredible things on the earth, didn't he? I mean, incredible things. He healed, made blind people see. He made deaf people, right? He made the lame walk. He raised the dead. You say, well, you didn't see any of that, Rex. No, I didn't. I've never seen any of that with my own eyes. But I believe it's credible. I believe our source is credible. And I believe there's historical things that back that up, too. And so I think that we have a credible source. And if Jesus can do those type of things that nobody else can do, right? Nobody else has ever done any of that stuff, right? I mean, only through God's power. Then if he says heaven's real, then why wouldn't I believe it? Isn't that what Jesus basically told him? He says, you saw the signs, you ate the loaves and filled, but not because you saw the signs. Jesus said, what did Peter say? He says, he was attested to you by signs, wonders, and miracles, right? In other words, you saw these things with your own eyes. He was talking to people that had saw those things with their own eyes. Isn't that what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 15? He said, this Jesus appeared to James and to me also as one out of season and more than 500 at one time. Many of you are still alive to this day. Isn't that what Paul said? Paul said, you saw it and you're here to argue with me if what I'm telling you is not true. There's people that are alive that witnessed the resurrection of Jesus Christ. They could dispute it. That's pretty powerful evidence, isn't it? That's what we call a first account evidence, right? In other words, we're talking to people who were there, people who saw it with their own eyes, people who heard it with their own ears. We're talking to people credible. Because of that, we believe the Bible has credibility, right? We believe that God has credibility. We believe that Christ has credibility. And if we believe that, then we have faith that what Jesus says will occur. Now, the Hebrew writer understands that nobody here has ever seen heaven. But when we talk about the people we're fixing to talk about in the Old Testament, you need to remember one thing. Those people weren't looking for heaven. There ain't a single person, really, in Hebrews 11 that was looking for heaven. Now, maybe they understood that was a reality. Maybe they understood that could happen. But most of those people we're going to look at in the book of Hebrews, most of those people were looking for the promise of Canaan. They weren't looking for heaven. The Hebrew writer is going to play on that. You'll see. So as we look at these Old Testament characters in the book of Hebrews, we begin to get a picture of faith. What faith is and how faith changed these people's lives and how it led us to Jesus. I don't know why necessarily he picked the people that's in here. One in particular I wouldn't have picked. Maybe two, one for sure. We'll talk about that a little bit. But he did. Hebrews 1, right? Faith is the, and of course this is a New American Standard, I think, and I'm so used to King James. But you know, faith is evidence of things hoped for, the substance of things not seen. But New American Standard says, being sure of what we hope for and certain of what we do not see. So, but I really like King James because King James says it's the evidence of it. And as a child or as a young person, I always read that verse and I thought, how is faith an evidence, right? How can faith, and I really think that's a better translation of the word. How is faith an evidence, right? How is faith evidence? And then I thought about my own life. And, you know, of course, I know I talk about my granny a lot, and some might maybe get tired of hearing about my granny, but she was a big influence in my life. And she was an evidence of faith to me. The way she lived her life, the way that she dealt with people, the way that she always trusted in God in any situation, that was an evidence to me. That convicted me, convinced me. Because of what her life and how she lived it, she convinced me that Jesus was real, that God was real. You know, at some point, something has to convince you, doesn't it? Something has to convince you that this isn't a hoax, that this isn't just a elaborate story. And if it ever gets to that point in your life that it convicts you of it, that it convinces you of it, then that's really what changes your life. That's what real faith is. Faith is convincing that what God says will happen, what I've hoped for exists, even though I can't see it, it's there. This is what the ancients were commended for. It's in Hebrews 3:11-3 is really interesting and a fascinating, I believe, and it's a verse I never really paid much attention to until the last year or so, but it's a verse that's really stuck out in my head because it's really at one place in the Bible, and I know you say, oh, we're actually going to Genesis, but I maybe have a different view of that than most people do, but it's really one place in the Bible where a Bible writer says, guess what? God created things out of nothing, out of air, invisibility. Right? He didn't just order things, just put things together, but he made it from nothing. Right? We believe that what's visible was made out of what was not visible. We believe that the universe, now that's an interesting word, and that's kind of a translational word because they didn't think of the universe the way me and you think of the universe, okay? But they said the universe was made formed at God's command so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. That's a huge statement, isn't it? I mean, I can make a lot of things if I got something to make it with, right? But I can't make anything if I don't have anything. Nobody can, right? I mean, we can be the most creative person on earth, but we can't create matter. We can't create to create, right? We can't do that. And Hebrews is one of the few places where you really get that picture of this God that made the universe from air, from vacuum, from nothing, right? That's an unbelievable idea. But it's really what he talks about here. And he says the reason we can believe that is because of these people and their faith and what their faith was right. Now, as we go through this list, well, that's not a very easy slide to read. I apologize for that. As we go through this list, you're going to see a lot of Old Testament people. Not all the Old Testament people. And like I said, a couple of them I probably wouldn't have included, but I didn't write Hebrews, so I guess that's not my point to make. So if we, is that better? So if we really look at this list here of these Old Testament people that we talk about, what do we know about these people? Well, number one was Abel. What do you know about Abel? What was the deal with Abel? Who was Abel's brother? Yeah, and Cain did what to Abel? He killed him. We don't know very much about Abel, do we? Just that his brother got mad at him and killed him. That's really what we know about Abel, right? Don't know much other than that. Why did he kill him? Well, the Hebrew writers got a thought on that, right? He killed him because he was jealous of him, right? He was jealous because God recognized his sacrifice and or Abel's sacrifice and didn't recognize Cain's sacrifice. But there's always been a debate about that. Why? Why did God say, oh, well, I like Abel's sacrifice and I don't like Cain's? Well, of course, the pat answer everybody always tells you is, well, because one was a blood sacrifice, one was a grain sacrifice. But that doesn't hold any water, because there were grain sacrifices and there were blood sacrifices. And that was a law. And we're pre-law here, right? This is patriarchal. This is Genesis. This is the beginning of Genesis. There's no Mosaic law. There's no commandment to sacrifice at all, as far as we know. We don't even know how they knew to sacrifice. We have to assume God told them to do it, and we have to assume God told them how to do it. We have to fill that blank in, because we don't have any sacrifice before this. This is the first. We don't have a reference to what sacrifice was. We don't even know. It just pops up. Well, they did it. And you have to ask yourself, well, why? Well, the only good answer is because God told them to, even though we don't have the record of God telling them to. Apparently, God told them to do it, right? And then we have to ask ourselves, but why was one accepted to God and one wasn't accepted to God? And the Hebrew writer probably fills that blank in better than any other place in the Bible. Enoch, what do you know about Enoch? The Bible says that Enoch did what with God? Walked with God. Enoch is one of, two people in the Bible, is that right? That never died, right? And Enoch was taken up, same year as flood, right? So Enoch was taken up to be with God. Enoch, that's what we call transliterated. Enoch was transliterated to God. Who was the other one that was transliterated to God? Went up in the fiery chariot. Elijah, right? Never died. Two people in the Bible that never died. Okay, well, we know Noah, right? But the Hebrew writer tells some things about Noah that maybe we didn't know till we got to the book of Hebrews. So we get a little insight into Noah. Abraham, we know Abraham, right? What do you think Abraham's greatest act of faith was? Huh? Yeah, I think offering his son, don't you? Offering Isaac. Wasn't that a huge amount of faith? And the Hebrew writer gives us insight into why he was able to do that. And it kind of makes it make more sense. So the Hebrew writer gives us some really good insight into these people. You know, Sarah, was Sarah a person of faith, do you think? I mean, isn't she the one that when they said you're going to have a child, what did she do? She laughed, right? So you see Sarah as a real pillar of faith? Would you really put Sarah as, just what we know about Sarah, would you really put her up as a pillar of faith, do you think? Yeah, she stuck with Abraham. But you know, you kind of wonder about that, right? What does the Hebrew writer see in Sarah that I don't really see in Sarah? Because I really don't see Sarah. I see her as an instrument that God used to get us Isaac. But I don't really see Sarah in my mind. I mean, number one, she didn't have the faith to wait on God to give him a child, right? She gave her handmaid unto Abraham, right? Gave Hagar because she didn't wait. And the other thing was when the angel of the Lord finally came and said, guess what? You're going to have a child. She laughed, right? And I just have a hard time with that with Sarah. I don't really see her as a pillar of faith, but the Hebrew writer includes her in this list. Isaac. That's an interesting one, isn't it? What do you think about Isaac? What did he do to demonstrate faith, do you think? I mean, Isaac was in the middle, wasn't he? Because Abraham begot Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob became Israel, and the 12 tribes come out of Jacob, but in the middle of that was Isaac, right? And Isaac married, who'd Isaac marry? Rebekah, right? But when I think of Isaac, I don't know. I don't have a big opinion about Isaac. I just don't think he's a real colorful character in the Bible. He's just kind of in the middle, right? He married Rebekah. He had, I just don't see him being real colorful. He's just not one of the people that really stand out to me. But he's in that lineage, right? And I think at this point we begin to see the lineage. Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Jacob, Joseph, right? Moses. That lineage. That patriarchal lineage. So Abraham, Isaac, right? What about Jacob? Well, my opinion of Jacob has never been real high. I'm sure Jacob's going to talk to me about that when I get to heaven. Probably slap me around a little bit, so I probably didn't know the whole story. Maybe I don't know. But Jacob always seemed a little bit conniving to me, he tricked his brother, right, basically. Tricked his dad. He was a mama's boy, wasn't he? Yeah, Dolores laughing. He was a mama's boy, right? Mama told him to do it. He did it. Trick your father. Okay, Mom. I'm on that. Right? Ran off, right? His mom sent him off, didn't face the music with his brother, ran off, worked for 7 years and got the wrong woman, right? And then instead of standing up and throwing a fit, he worked 7 more to get the right one. You know what kind of guy is that, right? I mean, he's just not really a man's man, is he? Until he wrestles with the angel, gets touched in the thigh, and all of a sudden his life seems to change and he seems to get on track. I'll give him that, right? But you begin to wonder, well, how did Jacob have faith? How did Isaac have faith? Abraham, we can see. But then you begin to say, well, how did they, what was their faith? They were just kind of riding on Abraham's. God didn't really deal with them like he did Abraham. God didn't really talk, as far as we know, really talk to Isaac like he did Abraham. God didn't really talk to Jacob. Although Jacob saw the angels ascending and descending and basically made this pact with God and had these visions, which was more than Isaac, I think, had. But God didn't have that direct relationship that he had with Abraham. And then Joseph, Joseph, we can see that in Joseph, I think. We can see great faith in Joseph, can't we? And maybe morality in Joseph, right? He wouldn't give in to the lady, wouldn't give in to Potiphar's wife, right? Even though she wanted to seduce him and that would have been the easy road, he stood his ground and went to prison and got forgotten, right? And finally got out. And then he had mercy on his brothers. And I think maybe that was his faith, right? He knew there was a bigger plan. We can see that, right? Matter of fact, Joseph says, you intended it for harm, right? But God intended it for good. Joseph really had faith of God's overall art. So I can see that with Joseph. Moses, I think that's pretty self-explanatory. Joshua, man. Joshua is a guy that just didn't do anything wrong. There's not many people in the Bible that didn't do anything wrong. But as far as I've ever been able to tell, Joshua was a man who never did anything wrong. Joshua did exactly what God wanted him to do, exactly when God wanted him to do it, right? Joshua lived his whole full life out. And at the end of Joshua 24, he says, our great thing we always remember, right? Today you choose who you shall serve, but as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. I mean, that was Joshua's life. And probably the only thing you could really fault Joshua for was maybe when they got defeated and at Ai, and Joshua tore his clothes and fell at the ground. And God said to Joshua, he says, get up and do something. That's maybe the only thing you could even find in Joshua where maybe Joshua didn't do what God wanted him to do, right? He's just one of them guys, there's just not much wrong with him. He was the one who went into the promised land, remember? Joshua and Caleb went in, said, we can take it. Everybody else said we can't. And then Joshua takes over from Moses and leads them into the promised land and defeats all those enemies of Israel and divides up the land. And, Joshua was an amazing individual. What about Rahab? What was her occupation? Yeah, which is a what? She's a prostitute, right? Harlot's kind of the biblical word, but she was a prostitute, right? Sold herself for money. I don't know how much faith Rahab had. I think Rahab played the safe card, to me. She let them in, really didn't risk, except for keeping them there. Then once they were gone, if they hadn't came or hadn't taken the city, she would have been all right. I mean, she had her bases covered either direction, but it worked out good for her. And the Bible says, or Jewish tradition says, not the Bible, Jewish tradition says that Rahab was the most beautiful woman ever. Did you know that? It says Rahab was the most beautiful woman ever. I don't know how beautiful she was, but it says she was the most beautiful woman. Jewish tradition says she was the most beautiful woman ever. I don't know what that means. I don't know how they define beauty in the Old Testament, but that's Jewish tradition. Gideon, I don't know. When God told him to go do it, what did Gideon say? Remember the story? Huh? Well, before that, he said, God, I want you to do what? Prove it. How did he prove it? Remember? Sheepskin, right? Dew on the ground, dew on the fleece. And then he said, oh, that's not good enough. Right? So tomorrow morning, let's have, right? One morning it was dew on the ground and not on the fleece. And then he said, well, that could be a fluke. So the next morning I went dew on the fleece and not on the ground. Right? So, Gideon wasn't all in. Matter of fact, when the angel of the Lord came to Gideon, if you remember the story, Gideon was threshing wheat in a wine press. Remember that? So the Midianites wouldn't take his grain. You can't really thresh wheat in a wine. I've never threshed wheat in my life, just throwing that out there, but I know the premise. You throw it in the air and you let the wind carry away the chaff and the wheat falls to the floor. It doesn't work real good in the wine press, right? And then when the angel of the Lord come in and said, great and mighty warrior, Gideon certainly didn't believe that was him. He thought the angel had the wrong guy. But here we go. We'll talk about Gideon. And then Barak. What do you know about Barak? Who was his cohort judge? Does anybody know? One of the only female judges. Deborah. Yeah, Deborah and Barak. You remember the story? God says, go fight. Barak says, this is a really big paraphrase, by the way. Barak said, I'll only go if Deborah goes, and I'll tag along. Remember that story? So Deborah goes and basically fights the battle, and Barak just kind of tags along. So, I don't know how much great faith Barak had. But he's there, huh? He has some faith in Deborah. That's true. Yeah. Samson. That's an interesting study within itself, isn't it? The guy with all the strength and don't cut my hair, and then he did, right? And why do you think he finally told her to cut his hair? Why do you think he gave in to that? Don't you think he knew that she was after his secret? She wore him down. I think Samson told her because I think Samson had come to the point in his life that he believed it was him, not God. I don't think he thought he needed his hair anymore. Remember right? She cut his hair. Remember the story? And he gets up to fight the Philistines as before. Have you ever really thought about that passage just a little bit? I've got this beard. I'm here to tell you, if I shave my beard tonight, all day tomorrow, all day tonight, all night tonight, I'd be like, I would know it, right? Now, if you had hair your whole life and it had never been cut, when you got up and that hair wasn't there, you'd know it. Remember? And I think if I was Samson, I would have went, my hair, I'm going out the back door, right? But Samson got up and said, and went out to fight the Philistines as before, not knowing the spirit. Remember the story, right? Not knowing the spirit had departed from him. Samson had become confident. I think Samson had come to the point that the confidence was in Samson, not in God. Just my humble opinion. But that's what I think. Jephthah. What did Jephthah do, Billy? Tell me, what did he do? You remember? You always tell me. You always tell me this. What did he do? You remember that story? Sacrificed his daughter. Remember that story? Well, I don't know. I mean, he went to fight the battle. Number one, nobody liked him because he was a half-breed, but then they couldn't defeat anybody, so they went to God to bring him back because he was a great warrior and said, go out and defeat these people. And so he decides he's going to do it, but before he does it, he makes a vow to God. And he says, when I get him back, whatever the first thing that comes out of the door of my house, I'm going to sacrifice it. So he goes, God gives him the victory, comes back from the battle. First thing that comes out of his house was what? His daughter, right? God isn't real big on human sacrifice. I don't know if you ever caught that or not, but it's not a God thing. So there's a lot of speculation about exactly what happened. But that's what he said, right? But here he is. David's pretty self-explanatory, I think. Samuel, a little out of order. Samuel was a great guy. I love reading 1st and 2nd Samuel, especially 1 Samuel. Samuel was a real God-driven guy. Nazarite from birth, one of only 3 in the Bible that was a Nazarite from birth. Samson, Samuel, and John the Baptist. Nazarite from his mother's womb, but he never denied that. He never denied that like Samson did. Never denied that. Great man of God, Samson was. And Daniel. Well, we think of Daniel. A lot of big things for Daniel. We don't know much bad about Daniel, right? Daniel in the lion's den. Daniel standing up for God, becoming the God blessing Daniel in a lot of ways. So that's our list. That's our guys and women. Guys and gals. Interesting list. A prostitute, right? A man who sacrificed his daughter. A man who maybe created the biggest sin of the Bible, right? And yet God loved him. God is after God's own heart. A woman who laughed at God is on this list. Interesting list. All faithful. But there's some comfort in that, I think, right? Because if they were faithful, and they were mess-ups, then maybe I'm all right, right? Because I'm kind of a mess up, right? So I think there's some comfort in the whole thing. By faith, the Hebrew writer says, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain. By faith, he was commended as righteous when God spoke well of his offerings. And by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. By faith, Abel brought God a better offering than Cain. I don't think it was the kind of offering. I think it was the faith of his offering. So when you say by faith he gave an offering, what do you think that the difference between an offering given in faith and an offering not given in faith? What do you think the difference? You really thought about that? What would the difference in that be, do you think? He's trusting in God to provide back more than he's offering, right? He's got faith that God is going to bless him for his offering, that he's not going to miss it. Cain maybe was grudging. Well, I'm going to do this, but I really don't want to. I'm giving up this. I'm not going to get it back, right? And maybe Abel was thinking, well, I'm glad to do this because God gave it to me and God's going to bless me more. Maybe, I think. God spoke well of his offerings, and by faith, Abel still speaks even though he is dead. Abel speaks even though he is dead. So, isn't it interesting in that account in Genesis when God says, your brother's what speaks to me from the ground? Your brother's blood speaks to me from the ground. And the Old Testament says the life is in the blood, right? And even though he's dead, he still speaks. Isn't that? I always thought that was fascinating, right? Your brother's blood speaks to me from the ground. It's a really interesting way to put that, I think. Enoch was taken from this life so he did not experience death. He could not be found because God had taken him away. For before he was taken, he was commended as one who pleased God. We don't really know much about Enoch, why he pleased God, why he stood out. There's a lot of people in the Bible. We don't know why they stood out in God's mind. But Enoch, who lived a long, long time on this earth, right? Long, long time on this earth, centuries on this earth. Enoch pleased God, the Hebrew writer says. And because of that, God rewarded him and that he didn't taste death. Can we think about that for half a second? We talk a lot about death, right? Where we go and we die, or we sleep, or we not asleep, or we... And in the Old Testament, we don't talk much about people going to God, heaven, like we think of heaven. It's not really an Old Testament idea. And we say, well, you really can't go to heaven unless, you're sinless. Of course, the Bible says before there was law, there was no sin, right? And Enoch was way before law, but it says that God took him up. So doesn't that kind of make you think that he never went to sleep or anything, did he? He just went to God, didn't he? He just went to where God was. Don't you think? I mean, I do. Elijah was on that flaming chariot, right? Chariot of fire. And Elijah just went to be with God. I mean, isn't that kind of interesting? Do you think? I think it is. We don't talk much about them people when we talk about where you go when you die or what happens to you when you die. We don't talk much about those two guys, but I just think it's really interesting, don't you? They just went to God. Do what now? Mm-hmm. Yeah, Elijah was on Mount Transfiguration. Mm-hmm. Oh, obviously, they were very unique in the Bible, very unique. Nobody else like them. I mean, they were, and it attests to one of those things I think Gary talks about sometimes that, there's things in the Bible that they're not supposed to be duplicated. I mean, they're not a duplicated thing. They're very unique, very special. Day of Pentecost, Household of Cornelius, things like that are once in a time deal, and once in a world deal, right? But I just think it's just a fascinating concept that, they went right to be with God. I just think that's really fascinating. But he pleased God, the Bible says. And then in Hebrews 11:6, and I think that's a memory verse to me, Hebrews 11:6. I just think that should be a memory verse. There's 2 or 3 verses in the Bible I think should be memory verses, and this is one of them. Without faith, it is impossible to please God, because anyone who comes to him must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who seek him. So the Hebrew writer says there's 2 things we need to believe. 2 things. And this is what all these people are teaching us. We need to believe, number 1, that he exists, right? And number 2, that he's a rewarder of those who seek him. That's what all these people, the Hebrew writer is going to bring up with all these people, is that God, they understood. We'll get through Enoch, we get through Enoch, we get through Abel. Now we're getting into this other list. We'll start talking about Abraham, right? They're people who believed in the reward that God said exists for them. And as Christians, that's what we have to believe. Not just that God exists, not just that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That's not enough. We have to believe that he's going to reward us with something, that he's a rewarder, and that his promises are true. And if he says heaven's our reward, then we have to have faith that heaven exists. I believe that's part of our faith. We have to believe in heaven. We don't just have to believe that God is, that he's going to save our souls, he's going to wash away our sins. That's all great things, but I think the Hebrew writer really lays it out. We have to believe that heaven's real. Heaven's real. We're out of time. I know. I know.